The law matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Morais, your host and moderator. This program's been created to educate, inform, and help you with the law matters because, as we say, the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and maybe your business. We provide information and resources that'll help you decide whether or not you actually may want to handle some issues yourself. Perhaps if you do, at least then you'll be better prepared. That's our goal. The other goal is to help save you time and money if you do decide to do this. The Bazaar and Associates law firm in East Providence continue to offer their expertise, their perspectives on all of the issues that we tackle, and once again we want to welcome and thank Attorney David Bazaar.
Thank you.
So today our discussion will be about judges, nominations, selections, elections, vetting, and why it matters to you, because it does. The easy answer, of course, is that there's supposed to be a perception of fairness, impartiality in order to have complete justice. So how does that actually take place? Of the court cases that are filed annually in the U.S., about 1 million end up being filed in federal courts, but there are more like 30 million filed in the state courts, and the state courts adjudicate the vast majority of criminal cases, which may impact your life, although we hope not. And nearly all of the felony convictions, apparently 94% occur in state courts, including 99% of rape cases and 98% of murder cases. So it does matter who's sitting on the bench. And at the Supreme Court level, that's certainly a hot topic right now. That's, of course, the highest judicial body in the nation, and it leads the judicial branch of the federal government. Right now, as of this topic and as of this session, Donald Trump's Supreme Court justice will be an issue very soon. And as we understand it, based on the Obama nominee, Merrick Garland, he can go back to his day job. So when it comes to judges, the big, broad brush stroke question is, how are they selected, David?
Well, there's different states that do it different ways, and the federal government has its process. So we can talk about first, before we get into the specifics of the federal process, Rhode Island and Massachusetts, just what maybe we should do a little civics lesson again on the role of each branch of government.
I was going to ask that too. So if you'd like to begin there, perfect.
So let's start there. So as you know, we have 3 branches of government that have checks and balances. And the executive branch in the state world is the governor, and in the federal world, the president. And then in the federal world, there's Congress, the Senate, and the House, and then the judiciary. And the Constitution set these branches up as co-equal branches of government. The executive branch runs the executive powers of government. The House and Congress and Senate, the Senate and House and Congress create the laws, the president signs them into law, and the Supreme Court and the federal courts have the review power over whether those laws may pass constitutional muster, etc. So there's these checks and balances. And as a result, the judiciary has a very important role of being independent, which was one of the words I was waiting for you to say at the very beginning, because it's the independence of the judiciary that is really important. And so it sets us up into the conversation a little bit of how judges are picked and what their tenure is, for example. In the federal level, it's a lifetime appointment, and you can only be removed for cause. Same in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, although in Massachusetts there's a mandatory retirement age.
Of 70, I believe.
Correct. So there are other states that elect their judges. And this becomes very problematic in this checks and balances world, where you want your president and your governor to be accountable to the people, your senators and congressmen to be accountable to the people, but you want the judges to have their independence, because oftentimes a decision that a judge has to make is the right decision, but not the popular decision. And so if a judge is elected, it becomes, is the judge going to do his or her job, to do the job correctly, or to do it to get reelected?
And is this perhaps the time to talk about some of them are partisan, some are nonpartisan appointments, and of course you do care about where judges, whether they follow their own personal ideology or follow the letter of the law and what is supposed to be done. So do you want to begin at the state level now and talk about that?
Either one, but part of what you're talking about is that you want it to be nonpartisan. And of course you do. You want to pick the best judges that you can pick, and theoretically that's what Massachusetts and Rhode Island have set up as processes to do that. What then has to be looked at is, well, we're trying to create these processes that are not political. But even that pick is a political pick in many ways, and politics comes into that process. The more you can keep it out and do it based on the person's ability to be a really good judge and the qualifications that go into that, the better off you are.
And of course, that's why they have, at least, as we'll talk about it later in the Supreme Court, they have hearings.
Right.
So they can vet.
They do.
As best they can.
Right. So let's start with Massachusetts, okay?
Sure.
So in Massachusetts, they have a judicial nominating commission. And that commission was not created by the legislature or by law legislatively, so to speak, but rather by executive order. And the governor created an executive order to appoint this commission. So the job of the Judicial Nominating Commission is to vet somebody who wants to be a judge to determine whether they're qualified to be a judge. The hope would be that this commission is not subject to the pressures of either the governor or other politicians and acts independently. The Massachusetts JNC actually began executive order from Governor Dukakis way back in the day, and then was reformed as it went along, and Mitt Romney created a very extensive order for the JNC. So when somebody wants to become a judge, the application submitted to the JNC, they do an interview and a whole process to determine whether or not the person is qualified, and if the person's qualified to be a judge, the name is passed along to the governor.
What are the qualifications to be a judge?
Well, they're different in different states and for different benches. And by benches, I mean, Superior Court, District Court, Workers' Compensation, Family Court in Rhode Island. They would all have different needs and qualifications. But I think it really comes down to qualification-wise, what's the person's experience? How much experience do they have in the court that they're looking to become a judge on? Here's the most important things to me. What is their judicial temperament? What experience do they have in handling situations like they would be in as judges?
When it comes to becoming a judge, I think most of our viewers would assume that all judges have been lawyers. Not always true. Not
required. Mostly true. But there's no requirement in Massachusetts. I don't believe there's any in Rhode Island. Although for some judgeships in Rhode Island, there is a requirement, I should say. Supreme Court does not require you to have been practicing as a lawyer anywhere. So I'm sure that it can happen, but it very rarely does happen.
When it comes to bankruptcy courts, do those need to be lawyers always?
So the bankruptcy court is a federal court. And the rules that apply to the federal court differ for different courts. I'm not 100% sure if bankruptcy court requires someone to be a lawyer, but certainly there's a lot of background in the world of finance and economics and all of that that person needs to have.
Okay, so if we talk about the federal court, there's an Article 1 and Article 3, different courts, and they cover different things. The Article 3 appellate courts, Supreme Courts, Article 1 is, I guess it varies by state apparently, and all of those refer to what the governor's appointments or nominations are likely to be
go ahead.
Continue.
In federal court,
yes.
Article 3 generally refers to the Constitution, and in the Constitution, the only courts set up by the Constitution is the Supreme Court, and such inferior courts as Congress may set up from time to time. So what's been set up, I would call Article 3 courts are the Supreme Court, Circuit Court of Appeals, and perhaps the district courts that are formed in each state. Article 1 courts, I would say, are more out of the executive branch and are slightly different as a result.
Apparently, they can include the bankruptcy courts and tax courts, and I think they refer to some as military courts.
Yeah, because
varying states.
they're not created by the Constitution. They're created in another form or fashion where it results from the power of the executive branch creating them, rather than the Constitution and legislatively have been created that way.
When we talked, you spoke a little bit earlier about in Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, almost everything seems to be governor. Do you want it appointed by? And then there are other levels of that. Would you like to address
so
that a
we
little
can
bit?
do Rhode Island, but we should finish the process in Mass.
Okay, and then, okay, fair
and then
enough.
we'll do Rhode Island.
You want to go a little deeper in that?
The Judicial Nominating Commission recommends to the governor. The governor then can select somebody that's recommended to him for an opening. That person is then referred to the Joint Bar Review Committee, which is a committee set up in Massachusetts based on the Mass Bar Association, the Boston Bar Association, and the other various bar associations throughout the state that have a representative on this committee that will then review the background and qualifications of the nominee at that point. The committee will then send to the governor a report that says well qualified, qualified, this four, not qualified being the lowest. And the governor can ignore that, but it's just another layer to make sure that the person who is being appointed to a judgeship is qualified.
And not only that, but also, isn't there an issue too about there being a representative sampling of the people who are on the committee from various districts so that everyone can feel that they are somewhat represented?
Yeah, well, I think you might be referring to the last level of appointment, okay?
Okay.
So the Bar Association is from various parts of the state. I don't know if you'd call them districts, but parts of the state and different bar associations. Once that review is done and sent back to the governor, if the governor is then going to push forward with the selection, it then goes to a review committee, which would have the equivalent in the federal government of the Senate advice and consent. Rhode Island uses the Senate advice and consent process. This is not the Senate, it's another committee that is voted on by district, as you were saying, and each district is represented, and that committee then has to approve the selection, and then the person becomes a judge.
And how long does that process usually take? Do you have a sense of that in Mass?
Yeah, so in Massachusetts, if you are found to be qualified, then the governor has 18 months to appoint you to a position. And then the process flows from there, and there's time frames for each one of those steps along the way that I'm not 100% sure of, but are fairly quick.
And then comparably in Rhode Island?
So Rhode Island has a judicial nominating commission, and that JNC is actually legislatively created, and there are appointments to the judicial nominating committee or commission in Rhode Island. That is, the governor has some selections, the president of the Senate has some selections, the Speaker of the House has some selections, and then the two minority representatives, I believe, have some representatives, the minority House leader and maybe the person in the Senate as well. The Senate person does too, I'm sure. I'm not sure about the House. In any event, so the politics sort of jump right out at you with that commission. And the commission is then sort of a little different from Massachusetts in this sense. What happens is the legislation says that when there is an opening in a statewide judicial vacancy, the governor shall submit that to the JNC, then they shall advertise that, and then they go through the process of selecting 3 to 5 people for that spot.
And vetting them accordingly.
Right. So that process is very interesting. As you know, I've been through that process and have had my name sent to the governor before. But that's the part of the process that I actually enjoyed the most.
Want to comment on that a little
Well,
bit?
most people will tell you that I'm crazy for even saying that because it's a very intense process. There's an application that is incredibly intense and long and covers everything. Like, where did you live when you were born? Where did you live before you were born? Of course, I'm only kidding. But on and on and on about everything. And then you submit that application along with, I believe it's 3 years of tax returns and a financial statement and anything else that you can think of. And the commission then meets to decide who they want to interview from the pool of applications that they get. So once they decide to interview you, then the state police do a background check. And that is also very intensive. And it's a situation where they'll come to see you and interview you, have you sign medical releases and other releases as they seem fit, go out and talk to the people you've listed in your application as people that they can contact for recommendations. They'll go and talk to your neighbors. And I know a lot of people have been through this process where the neighbors look at the person applying and say, did you do something wrong? You know, because they don't always tell you why they're there.
Of course not.
And so it's a pretty intense process. And then the interview before the JNC. And that's the part I'm saying I really liked. I found that the questions, for the most part, were really geared towards what kind of difference you felt you could make on a court as a judge. And I was applying for the family court. So for me, in my background, it's all about the children and trying to make a difference in children's lives. And there's so many ways that you can do that as a family court judge. But the discussion about how the court works, and some of the people who are appointed are not lawyers, so they're asking questions because they're genuinely interested. And for me, it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed that part of it.
That does sound fascinating.
It is. It's
Also grueling.
stressful. Yeah, it is, no doubt, but interesting. Then from there, what happens is they vote, and the list is sent to the governor of 3 to 5 people who they recommend for the opening. So that's where the process is a little bit less fun because it becomes very political. And it's hard for someone in private practice to go through this whole thing because every time your name is in the paper that you're on a list to become a judge and it's out there, your clients always start to question, are you going to be here for my case at the end of the day? Do I
Good
need
to
to
bring
get...
up that point.
Yeah,
That's
it's tough.
valid, sure.
So, you know, if you're a good lawyer with a good practice and you're going through this process and you do it more than 1 or 2 times, then your clients really start wondering.
Getting skittish, sure.
And it can affect your practice. It can be difficult.
Well, as we do know, you are a judge.
Yeah, municipal
At the
court.
municipal level. So as we're talking about judgeships, in the state of Rhode Island, there's a Rhode Island Traffic Tribunal, and they say that that's an assisted appointment with the Senate confirmation. And there's a workers' comp court, which many know about, that too, assisted appointment with Senate confirmation. There was the Rhode Island District Court, interesting, assisted with Senate confirmation, all of these life terms, excuse me. Family court, which is one of the things that you were looking at, correct? As I said, assisted appointment with Senate confirmation. And then there's the Superior and Supreme Court. Superior Court, House and Senate confirmation. But Rhode Island Supreme Court, I'm
No,
wrong,
it's the other
excuse
way
me, it's the other way
around.
around.
Yep.
Supreme Court is House and Senate, but the Superior Court is
Senate.
Senate. So these different levels that you're describing, I understand it must be grueling to go through the vetting, but also I can see clearly that there's the issue about politics that you'd have to question or bring into the conversation just by virtue of that structure.
So, just going back to the attorney in private practice issue, the statute says that the governor shall appoint someone or recommend someone to the Senate for confirmation within 21 days of getting that list. I don't think it has ever happened in the history of the JNC, certainly not in the last 15, 20 years or so. And it is because the picks become a little bit political. The Senate gets the advice and consent. The House controls the budget to some degree so that they get weigh in. So the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and the Governor need to be on the same page. And to do that in 21 days is almost impossible. So that's why it's difficult, because I've been on lists where the governor hasn't filled the vacancy for more than a year. And you sit out there for more than a year with that uncertainty, it's tough on your practice. So the answer to the question is politics involved? Yes, of course. There's a lot of give and take between the Senate President, the governor, and the Speaker of the House as to who's the best person to pick for a particular spot and why. But it's the person who's on the list that gets dragged out for all that time that really is in a difficult position.
I do want to carry through on the political issue, but while we're talking about the consequences that you feel as a lawyer, how about 2 or 4 of the viewers who might be in the unfortunate situation of having to go to court because they are charged with a crime? They too might care about who's on the bench for their criminal case. Why might they care?
Well, I mean, that's really just a matter of what judge you're in front of and,
Yes.
and what that particular judge's history, experience, and background is. There can be some difference on that, but that's not really what goes into picking a judge and how the House and the Senate and the governor look at that. Here's where what you're saying will come out in a vetting process, and that's the federal system that we really haven't talked about yet. But when the Senate is grilling a potential judge on their background, primarily you're going to see that on the Supreme Court.
Which is where we need to go next.
Right. And the reason for that is because now that person's background as one of a limited number of judges is going to have a lot of impact and influence on the whole judicial world going forward for many years.
Which is why we wanted to speak about that next.
Okay.
So, yes, it's the president who gets to nominate. Well, that had been Barack Obama, and he did come up with a nominee who wasn't even heard. That was backburnered, and of course, as I said at the opening of the segment, he's going back to the day job tomorrow. Starts President Trump's reign, and he will have to have his nominations submitted. Apparently, even before he was president-elected, he had a list submitted to him, some 120 names. People do care about that, and do you want to elaborate on what's going to happen? There's at least one that we know he has to replace. There could be even more, so.
You mean on the Supreme Court? Or?
On the Supreme, we know one right now because of the recent
Of course,
death.
Antonin Scalia, right. So, again, this is even more political than a state level kind of situation. And the state level, it's just the way it is. I think it's pretty damn good in the long run for who we get picked for judges. It's, my frustration was just my own personal frustration of the length of it. But in the end, the process is really pretty good. Could that process be better? There's ways of making it better. Yes, there's always ways of making it better. I sort of like for Rhode Island to consider and look at the Massachusetts structure
model.
with just adding the Joint Bar Association review. For what it's worth, I think it would just add another layer of protection to making sure you get the best of the best. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but the process is pretty good because you end up with really, usually, almost 100% of the time, really, really good judges who are independent, don't have to run for election, and are there for life and do a good job. The federal system, which is politics on steroids,
well put,
is somewhat frustrating for me as just an average citizen, looking at it and saying, you have a president, you have an opening, you should have an obligation as the Senate to act on that opening and not try for political reasons to hold it until you get to pick who you want. And I'm not talking just, Obama in this pick, but whoever the president, Republican or Democrat, to have their picks heard and
course,
voted on.
As you mentioned on steroids, this could become a very big issue once President-elect Trump has his nomination submitted. If the Democrats decide to filibuster, you might want to review that, but if they decide to do that, that has additional consequences. But there are many factors that any president has to consider when it comes to nominating. And of course, you talk about experience, his temperament, his ideology, or is he an ideologue? But when it comes to this actual nomination being submitted, that vetting process is going to be, I guess, perhaps another contentious partisan issue to contend with.
So it is. And I don't have as big a problem with the vetting process as long as it's done in a timely fashion so that someone's nominated, the background checks are done, whatever else needs to be done is done, and then it goes to the Senate Judiciary Committee. The committee does its job, and in the course of vetting, the candidate finds the person's not qualified, then so be it, it's rejected, and the president has to nominate somebody else. My bigger problem is not even having the hearings to let that happen. And sure, what are they doing? They want to make sure that, well, if there's a new president, that president gets the pick. What are we going to do? Hold it for 4 years in case there's another new president and then another 4 years? You got to let the system run because you're affecting something very important to the people, the judiciary. And at some point, you're going to cripple the judiciary if you don't start making appointments.
So your issue really is about the how the process has been so delayed, not
Right.
that it's just a matter of the bipartisan issue.
Yeah, I understand the partisan part of it, and I understand the vetting. And you know what? If someone is well qualified and smart and collegial, I think that's an important thing for the Supreme Court, and willing to listen to arguments back and forth, and may not come across with what I would say is my bent one way or another, but otherwise qualified, then I want that person to get the job rather than no one to get the job.
That makes, what you're saying sounds so very reasonable, and if it works that way, that's how it should work, and it doesn't always. To hear now that there are issues not just about whether they're too conservative, too liberal, even what their ethnicity and gender is, that ends up, I think, certainly muddying the waters. As you were saying earlier, the things that you want to review them, experience, their ideology, their party loyalties or their personal loyalties, and what they're truly about versus whether they happen to be as male, female, or unable to view a case or hear a case. They
Right.
should recuse themselves because they're Mexican, American
Yeah.
descent or some other. That certainly does muddy the waters.
No, you want to choose a person who's the best qualified person for the particular vacancy. End of story. If it's a Mexican woman who's that most qualified person, she should get picked. Are there cases that any judge may find him or herself unable to sit for whatever reason and has to recuse himself? That happens, but it should be allowed to happen.
I think yours was the best and last word. That is that it should be the best possible at the state and federal level. We hope that this has been helpful to you as we talk about judges on all of those levels, and I assume we'll soon have a Supreme Court bench filled. Stay tuned to The Law Matters. We'll discuss other topics. The law matters to you.